Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Emily Cash, Account Manager at FreightWaves, and I'm happy to present this webinar in partnership with Chevron Renewable Energy Group. Today, we will explore FreightWaves and Chevron Renewable Energy Group partnering on a recent white paper survey to brokers, shippers, and carriers, which explores their progress towards adopting carbon reduction goals, as well as their perceptions and attitudes towards certain lower carbon solutions, including various vehicle technologies and alternative fuels. I'm happy to be joined by Rajani Modiyani, Senior Manager, Emerging Markets at Chevron Renewable Energy Group. In her role, Rajani supports the lower carbon journey of stakeholders across rail and mining markets, while leading commercial activities related to renewable fuels and these hardest to abate sectors. Prior to joining Chevron Renewable Energy Group, Rajani spent 13 years at a Tier 1 engine supplier, where she had a variety of roles with technical and commercial areas, contributing individually and leading teams. Rajani holds a Master's in Mechanical Engineering from Purdue University, where her research included developing advanced combustion recipes to reduce engine emissions while optimizing performance. And she also has an MBA from Kelley School of Business at Indiana University with a specialization in finance and strategy. Before we get started, I'd like to cover just a couple of housekeeping items. First, if you have any issues during the webinar, please visit the Help section function in your webinar console. We'll also be sending a link to the recording of this webinar tomorrow if you'd like to view it on demand or share it with your colleagues. And finally, you can download the white paper that we will be discussing today with the complete findings via your webinar console. At this point, we'll go ahead and dive into today's discussion. Rajani, tell us a little bit about what you're hoping to learn from this survey.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So specifically to your question, when we started this survey in partnership with FreightWaves, we were really curious to see how far along the industry is in terms of adopting reducing carbon intensity solutions. We also wanted to see this broken out by brokers, shippers, and carriers across various modes of transportation. On top of that, we also wanted to understand how they feel about these various different lower carbon solutions, including adoption of electric vehicles and various alternative fuels, such as LNG, CNG, hydrogen, renewable diesel, and biodiesel. And lastly, we also wanted to make sure we uncovered any potential barriers that these brokers, shippers, and carriers feel that stand in the way of adopting some of these lower carbon solutions.
Excellent. Do you think we accomplished what we set out to learn from this survey?
Oh, absolutely. I think we definitely understood what we wanted to uncover from the survey, but also really reaffirm what we knew and see what unknowns we had to still uncover, which is where we had really sent this survey out to a lot of different industries and different entities, whether it's the carriers, brokers, or shippers. And what we got back was a really good mix of a response. So about, as you can see on this slide, over 300 total respondents, and these are then broken out. And this was a nice mix between these carriers, shippers, and brokers. What you will also see is certain carriers like rail and marine were probably a lower percentage, so specifically around that 8%, which we actually expected, because if you really think of these two industries, you have fewer players and hence fewer number of respondents, but these fewer players are larger players, so as to speak. And essentially, we feel like the survey response provided us a nice variety, a right mix, where we could really extract some very valuable learnings from it. Furthermore, what we wanted to see is how this response really looked from a geographic sense. And as you can see in this view right here, we had a really good representation from across the country. We did get a lot of high concentration response from the East, North, Central region, which is expected because a large number of logistics companies are really headquartered in these areas. But you also see a very nice mix across the board here. So all in all, if you look at these two particular views that I just showed, I believe we have a good response base, a nice variety of responses, which can then enable us to learn a little bit more. So with that in mind, what we wanted to really understand in the next section also is how the carbon intensity goals really ranked for these various players in the supply chain base, whether it's the brokers, carriers, or shippers. And what we found essentially is a nice mix of response here. So you will see majority of our respondents have either already set a lower carbon goal, so roughly about 40%, or are actively working on it. So that's another 22%. So a wide base of the response already has these identified or are working on establishing them. But the remaining 38% don't have established goals and are not really working on it either. While I'm not necessarily surprised by that number, I fear those that are not prepared may be left behind based on some of the statistics we are seeing. So just an example of a statistic around that point is, according to the Fortune 500 companies survey, about 58% of the Fortune 500 companies, which is a very significant increase in the recent years, have established these targets to reach net zero by 2050. And of those businesses, roughly half of them already have plans in place to reduce the Scope 3 emissions in their supply chain. So although 2050 feels far away, there's a lot of work to be done, and getting it started today, however smaller those steps are, is very important. And this actually means that these logistic companies will increasingly need to show their carbon reduction efforts in order to remain competitive in serving customers who are on a path to net zero. So based on this response, especially with that 38%, what we really wanted to understand is how important these lower carbon goals were for the brokers and shippers, which are then selecting these carriers to move their goods. So this is what we found with that question. And what we saw is nearly a third of the shippers are already taking carriers' carbon reduction efforts into consideration when selecting who to work with. That percentage is lower for brokers at only 14% right now. But another 46% of shippers and about 50% of brokers recognize that reducing carbon intensity will be an increasingly important factor in the carrier selection in the near future. So to us, the key takeaway here is that vast majority of the shippers and brokers recognize that carbon reduction is an increasingly important criteria in the carrier selection. And those carriers who are not prepared to show their activities and efforts in this area will be less competitive than those who can, and this trend will just continue to increase over time. Once we understood that, we also wanted to ask these carriers if they really saw this pressure and their perspective on how this pressure shapes up what they see. And what we found is, from a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being never to 10 being very frequently or almost all the time, a combined total of nearly 68% are being asked about it at varying levels of frequency. If you really look at that chart and look at all the numbers 5 and above, 1/3 of the carriers have ranked it in that space, which means, very important, and they hear about it quite a bit. And that is where I think it reaffirmed for us on that very first question that carbon reduction, when it comes to supply chains and the players in the supply chains, is important. People who have set targets are ahead a little bit. Those who haven't set targets will probably continue to see increasing pressure to set those targets, and being prepared to really do something along that path is very important. So with that in mind, we then wanted to understand what really stood in the way of carriers who weren't setting these targets. What was preventing them from getting there? And we wanted to cover that next layer in this next section or series of questions. So what we found here when we asked about the hurdles to adopting those carbon reduction goals, we felt that about 46% of our respondents felt a lack of viable options stood in their way. And 41 just felt that it wasn't a priority for them. And 26% felt a lack of company resources stood in the way, because implementing a carbon reduction target, creating plans around it, can be a very resource intense process. But 26% didn't really have the resource base to address it. And about 20%, as you can see, just checked others. We'll talk a bit more about this as we get further along in today's conversation, but the idea is that there's a lack of viable options available today. And that to me was a very, very interesting finding in the survey. And it likely points to the fact that many of the solutions that are very, very prominently discussed as solutions are simply aren't viable solutions today. And there can be a variety of reasons that make those solutions that are talked about quite a bit not viable. And that can be anything from price of the solution, availability of that solution, or its supporting infrastructure, technology readiness, or otherwise. That said, if you really think about bio-based fuels, this solution is widely available today. It can be easily integrated into fleets, and this is generally without any investment in new equipment or infrastructure. And I'll discuss those solutions and bio-based diesels in a bit more detail here next. And then we wanted to really understand which solutions carriers were already using. So there was perceptions, viewpoints, but then the ones that are in use, what does that look like? What we found, which was not surprising at all, is that biodiesel, renewable diesel are being used by at least twice as many carriers as electric vehicles or CNG or LNG vehicles. We expect that number could be much higher, in fact. Close to 8% were actually not sure if they were using any of the above. Because biodiesel and renewable diesel are drop-in fuels that don't require any additional investments, whether it's equipment or infrastructure, often companies will fill up at the pump or will be provided a fuel, and it will have a certain content of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and they won't even be aware that they're using these fuels. So that's where we feel like, hey, that I'm not sure could actually have some biodiesel, renewable diesel in there. What we wanted to then find out is how people think about the bio-based fuels when it comes to lowering their carbon targets. So as it relates to biodiesel, renewable diesel, we dove deeper into the carrier's plans to begin using these bio-based fuels or expand upon their current use. We broke this out by renewable diesel and biodiesel separately. And what we found is about 42% said that they were already using biodiesel, and 27% said they are using renewable diesel. And about 29% of both current users and non-users said that they plan to increase their usage or begin using biodiesel. So for renewable diesel, that combined number is close to 40%. So as you can see, the viability of the fuel, the availability of it is driving more and more people to believe that's a solution that is viable today and can effectively be used to reduce the carbon footprint. We also have about half of the respondents that said they don't have a plan to use biodiesel, and a little more than half said they don't have a plan to use renewable diesel. And this is where next we wanted to really understand why that might be the case for these carriers who responded that way. And when we asked the question to uncover that, what we found is there were some perceived barriers that are stopping people from beginning to use or expanding to use biodiesel and renewable diesel. In most cases, these perceived barriers are misconceptions, which I'll address one by one here. The very first one that we found that our respondents, nearly 54% of our respondents talked about, was engine performance. Nearly over half of them really are concerned about engine performance, and that makes sense because these are the assets that drive the operations, and to have that worry that biodiesel, renewable diesel impact your engine performance is a very important one that we should discuss here today. The truth is, biodiesel actually offers improved lubricity and combustion. And because of that improved lubricity and combustion of the fuel inside the combustion chamber, in fact, the users observe reduced DPF clogging. And because of that reduced DPF clogging, they also encounter fewer number of regeneration events for those DPFs if you compare it with petroleum diesel. And that was biodiesel. And thinking about renewable diesel, it is in fact considered a direct replacement to petroleum diesel, meaning its engine performance and use would virtually be identical to petroleum diesel. So I think with those aspects in mind, engine performance as a worry when it comes to biodiesel and renewable diesel is in fact a misconception because of the qualities of the fuel that we just talked about. Then let's look at what was the next worry or the next hurdle that our respondents talked about. So 50% said supply and availability stand in the way of them adopting biodiesel and renewable diesel. According to the Alternative Fuels Data Center, B20 and above B20 biodiesel blends are widely available at over 800 fueling stations throughout the country, whereas R20 and above renewable diesel blends are available at over 500 stations. A lot of these are located in California, of course, but they continue to expand. Lower blend levels of biodiesel and renewable diesel are even more widely available, to the point that sometimes people don't even realize they're using it. So from a standpoint of supply and availability, we again believe it's widely available, and that is where that shouldn't really hinder the carriers, shippers, and brokers from really thinking about that as a viable solution. The next one that came up, which is a very interesting one, is the fuel quality. So about half of the respondents are concerned about the quality of biodiesel and renewable diesel they receive. And just to baseline here a little bit, like all types of fuel, there can be a difference in quality from different producers. Chevron Renewable Energy Group has been an industry leader for biodiesel and continues to be one in terms of its quality. And we don't just meet the industry standard for biodiesel quality, which is the ASTM D6751 standard, but we go above and beyond that by participating in the BQ 9000 program, which basically sets higher standards for quality for biodiesel by making sure we follow additional quality assurance steps. Biodiesel also, in fact, exceeds some of the petroleum diesel specs, including cetane content and lubricity. So all in all, when you think of the biodiesel quality and you're looking at suppliers that are going above and beyond just the industry standard, or at a minimum meeting that industry standard, I believe that fuel quality concern shouldn't stand in the way of adoption of the solution. The next one we wanted to, that we uncovered through our survey was price. About, again, half of the respondents said price stood in the way, but it certainly shouldn't. If you look at about 23 years worth of data, and again, this is from Alternative Fuels Data Center, which is shown on this graph on the slide, biodiesel blends have been very consistent with the price of petroleum diesel. Plus, if you think of biodiesel and the price of integrating a lower carbon solution in your fleets, integrating biodiesel, renewable diesel is generally better in terms of cost because there is no need for additional equipment. There's basically no need for additional infrastructure. So it's a seamless integration and easy adoption when it comes to price, when you think of a fleet level adoption. And that's where we think, again, price shouldn't be a hurdle that stands in the way. The next one that we found was cold weather operation. And about 38% of our respondents said that was a key aspect that stood in the way of them adopting bio-based diesels. Now, contrary to some misconceptions, with proper blending, handling, storage, and use of additives when needed, biodiesel can be effectively used in extreme cold. With renewable diesel, which we just said acts as a direct replacement to petroleum diesel, it performs the same in cold weather as petroleum diesel. So again, from a cold weather standpoint, we feel like it's pretty much on par, can be integrated very easily. Yes, some consideration may be made in extreme cold weathers in terms of handling and storage, but that shouldn't be any different than what you see otherwise. We also asked about the infrastructure and storage. Since we've talked a bit about that, we felt like let's uncover what our respondents think about it. And 37% said infrastructure development and storage stood in the way. But the truth is, both biodiesel and renewable diesel can be used with existing infrastructure, whether you're thinking of storage tanks or whether you're thinking of the technology that's using the fuels, including engines. Generally, no additional investment is required. And that's where we feel like those concerns over infrastructure development and storage can be resolved by conversations that go in depth by understanding how the markets are utilizing it today. We also found that some of our respondents felt that carbon reduction effectiveness was a concern for them when it comes to biodiesel and renewable diesel. And about 1/3 of our respondents had concern over that aspect. But we do have some impressive stats to address that concern. If you compare to petroleum diesel, biodiesel and renewable diesel may reduce carbon emissions by up to 100% for fossil carbon. Biodiesel further can improve the total hydrocarbon footprint, so unburnt hydrocarbons, by 70%, and renewable diesel can reduce that by up to 40%. And this is a study that was conducted by California Air Resources Board. So if you really think in terms of total emissions reduction from a fossil carbon, it's 100% reduction in comparison. And even criteria emissions like particulate matter, that can be reduced by the use of biodiesel and renewable diesel. So that summarizes sort of the deep dive we did into various reasons or perceived hurdles, I should say, that our respondents thought stood in the way of adoption of biodiesel and renewable diesel. And then we also wanted to find out what the carbon intensity score of both biodiesel and renewable diesel looked like in comparison to some other solutions like LNG and hydrogen. And both of these have actually a lower score, and this is according, biodiesel and renewable diesel have a lower score in terms of carbon intensity when you compare to LNG and hydrogen. And this is based on a CARB report data that's published quarterly. Versus electric was another one, because that's a very prominently discussed solution. And this is where we found about 27% of our respondents had that concern. But if they were considering of an electric solution in comparison, what they would find is maybe about 56%. Biodiesel is about 56% more effective at reducing carbon emissions. Especially when you're taking into consideration the power grid that will then recharge your electric vehicles. And again, this is based on a 2020 eGrid figures, which is reported by the National Renewable Energy Lab. So this is publicly available data from national labs that points to that fact. In conclusion, what we found was the push for a lower carbon supply chain is not going to go away. Carriers, shippers, and brokers are feeling the pressure to implement lower carbon strategies. Many of them do need assistance and guidance regarding where to really start. Some of the most talked about solutions, like alternative vehicles, will likely not be viable industry wide solutions in the near term, and they may require significant infrastructure investment. And when implemented, it's going to take a long time to even implement. Biodiesel and renewable diesel, however, have proven themselves to be both accessible and effective to reduce carbon today. And many of the perceived barriers to adoption that we just dived into some details with some publicly available figures and data, this is where we believe most of those, if not all of those, are misunderstandings and shouldn't stand in the way of adoption there. So all in all, I feel like the survey, the responses really helped us kind of validate what we knew, also uncover or understand better, I must say, some of the details on what stood in the way of adopting some of the viable solutions that are available today for this very important part of the industry when it comes to the supply chains. Lastly, I just would like to offer for the audience, if you all and your organizations are ready to explore ways to integrate bio-based fuels in your operations, I really encourage you to reach out to us. Chevron Renewable Energy Group offers a complete line of high quality bio-based diesel fuel solutions. It's under our Endura Fuels brand. And we want to make sure we are partnering with you and working with you to really help you figure out the best path to lowering your carbon emissions. And typically, like we've said, this happens without intensive investment in new equipment or infrastructure. We can also help report your carbon reduction impact through our monthly greenhouse gas emissions reporting. Each month, we provide our customers with a lower carbon summary report that estimates metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions avoided by using our lower carbon fuel solutions. So not only can we help you make an immediate impact, use a solution available today without any impact to your operations using your existing assets, we can also help you track and quantify the impact, which you can then share with your shippers, customers when asked. And that should really enable you to get you started on your journey today. With that, I appreciate everybody's time today. And Emily, back over to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that is all the time that we do have for today. Thank you to everyone again for taking the time to listen in. And a big thank you to Rajani for sharing your insights with us today. Such an informative discussion, and I know our audience really appreciates you sharing your insights. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone tomorrow via the email you used to register with. Hope you'll join us again next time. Thanks, everyone.